Hi everybody and welcome to the latest edition of Infection Control Matters. Brett Mitchell here, and we've got something special as well for our podcast today and for the next at least 2 podcasts. And we're going to be exploring the somewhat interesting topic of contact, droplet and airborne transmission and where we should head in the future for this paradigm. So we've got a bit of a series of podcasts planned. We're going to ask people from across the world their views on some key questions. And those questions are going to be that we want them to say or describe or tell us their thoughts on whether they think the current contact, droplet and airborne transmission terminology is okay and whether it needs to change. If so, why? If not, why not? And then we're also going to ask about ideas that could make this better, or if something doesn't need to change, then how can we instill confidence in this paradigm? So we're going to interview people. We're going to keep it short and sharp. They're going to be 5 minutes maximum each, and you're going to hear views from all across the world. What do you reckon, Martin?
Oh, stunned into silence, clearly. No, I mean, I'm hoping things will change. I've got to be absolutely honest. I was over at the Shea Springs meeting this year, and they were saying CDC were undoubtedly going to be looking at changing things over the next year or so. It's trying to get some sort of consensus as to where we go with it then, and also it's droplets are dogma, I think, that have been with us for a long time. How do we get rid of it without appearing to lose face? So that's a tricky bit for me, really. So, I mean, well, maybe a tricky bit for many. I mean, it's not that tricky for me, I've got to be absolutely honest, because I'm completely convinced we've got it wrong.
And Phil, I guess part of this idea of this is that we're going to try and engage and hear different views, and really with the goal of this really being to try and move this discussion along.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of discussion going on underground, as we say at the moment, about how the current paradigms of the various transmission-based precautions really aren't meeting our needs and offering the safest protection for our healthcare workers and for our patients. And we've learnt that because of COVID. And I think we've got evidence now to suggest that those paradigms that we've known so well in our lives with infection prevention and control need to be rethought and redesigned to combat, not only COVID, but other emerging infections.
So before we hear from everybody, I guess I'm going to ask us three what we think, but I think we're all on the same page just from that intro that needs to change. So I wonder whether either of you have got thoughts about what a new world could look like in this area. And, I'm asking this up front because we're then going to start interviewing people over the next 2 weeks. And so our views might change by the time we wrap this up and summarise everyone's thoughts at the end of it in podcast 2 or 3, depending on how many of these we do. So any ideas up front from either of you?
Terminology has got to change, I think. Many people now think that, what's a droplet? And if you go talking to pure physicists, they don't talk about droplets, etc. It's all about the size of particles. And that was... When I'm listening to people like Lydia Morawska earlier on this year, you just think, why have we not been talking to physicists all along? And I think we need to really listen to other specialties with specific expertise in certain areas. And I'm not sure we've been doing that particularly well. I think we've been listening to ourselves quite a lot, but not to people who are clearly more expert in certain areas. And I mean, just this week, I declined to review a paper that I probably a year ago would have said, oh yeah, I'll review that paper. But it was looking at the effect of X on Y, but clearly it was physics. And now I'm thinking, really, I shouldn't be reviewing that paper because I've got IPC expertise, but I'm not a physicist. So I can't tell you about the dose of X on Y. So therefore, that's the sort of person who should be reviewing that paper, and we should be listening to to other folk. I think sometimes we're a little bit too insular, and I don't think there's anything wrong in the whole thing being thrown up in the air and being changed, because many areas of science have enormous changes which completely changes the way everybody thinks about something. And hopefully I think COVID will make us... I mean, it's not a bad thing to do it anyway, periodically, to say, have we been getting this right or wrong? But I think the answers may be in the too difficult box, and that's why people are a bit reluctant.
And of course, we did interview Lydia, I think probably about 12 months ago. We started talking about particles rather than droplets and aerosols, because I think everyone talks about something. So I think sometimes unintentionally, or we're talking about a similar thing, but the terminology we've used in our discipline does not match what's in other disciplines, and I think that's also been part of the problem. Phil, your thoughts? Any ideas early on, or where you think this could head?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think we need to walk the talk. Actually, we now have evidence to demonstrate that the current paradigms aren't working. Yeah, we need to look at new designs for the future. You know, we both, Brett and I, with our work that we did last year, you know, had a lot of exposure to aerosol engineers or airborne technicians. I can't remember what the exact terminology was now, Brett, but you know, they opened up a whole new world to our thinking about the transmission of respiratory viruses and the importance of airflow and ventilation, and really our current paradigms don't accommodate that well at all. So I think we need to essentially base our next set of recommendations on what we know and what we've learned.
Well, I'll ask myself the same question.
What do you think, Brett? What do you think?
Thanks, man. I'm cute. Look, I've got two random thoughts about this. One is perhaps we just go down the route of contact precautions and respiratory precautions and keep it quite simple. And we should be talking about particles, infectious particles. So, and thinking about in the respiratory side, then, you know, what we're dealing with. So to keep it relatively simple, you might have contact and respiratory-based precautions. But I think that's one idea. The other, it's a bit of a random idea, but, you know, what we've always focused on in infection prevention and control are modes of transmission. But what about we turn it on its head and think about portals of entry and base what we do on the portal of entry, whether that be injection, ingestion, inhalation, sexual transmission. So, you know, the things that we would put in place for those things to break that chain, if you like, are based on the route of entry. So if we're talking about respiratory pathogens, we're thinking about, well, how do we protect ourselves through that portal of entry? If we're talking about, you know, IV devices, we're talking about predominantly things like the portal of entry through skin becoming intact or injection of something. So I wonder whether that's another way completely to look at it and stop putting things in the boxes. I admit that probably puts things in boxes, but it also allows you to think about multiple layers of things at the same time, rather than just one thing that, as we saw with SARS, things don't fit nicely into a box. So, and of course, COVID as well. Anyway, that was my random thought about that. Needs a lot more thinking about, but I'm sure other people have got better ideas than that we're going to hear over the next little while.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
It's so tricky transmission, isn't it? Because you can't really nail it down, can you? Because you really don't know. We're making big guess plus big guess to get from A to B often. Because we know. Well, we've seen many papers that suggest that people who are Staph aureus carriers nasally have an increased risk of surgical site infection. So you actually use mipiracin or whatever to suppress it in the nose, and they seem to get less surgical site infection. What's the exact mechanism? Still struggling with that bit of it, because how does it get from the nose, into the patient's wound? Is this them exhaling and breathing out through the nose? Who knows? But it's really tricky, and I think we make a lot of assumptions in IPC, and it'd be nice to get probably more involved with engineers and scientists and physicists to actually try and track down some of the true roots. I mean, I think the whole genome sequencing is getting very interesting, and that will maybe help us track transmission a little bit better.
I think we need to know the relative importance of some of these different either portals of entry or modes of transmission. And once we understand that, we can through better science, we can think about what it is we need to put in place that's appropriate. So we're going to wrap up our little discussion here, and we're going to sign off, but we're going to follow this podcast now immediately with a couple of interviews from people that we've done. They're going to be short, as I say, short, sharp, 5-minute interviews. And we'll sort of sign off at the end of listening to those. And then the next podcast will have additional views from a range of people. You won't hear us rabbiting on more about this. And then we'll have a third podcast that will also have some views, and us then trying to come back and synthesize what we've heard from all the different people that we've interviewed and spoken to, and see if there's any consensus, see if there's any bones of contention, see if anyone's got any great ideas that perhaps could be thrown in the mix to take this forward. So that's the plan for the next few episodes. We hope you enjoy this sort of different sort of podcast that we've put together.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really interesting, and hopefully we'll get some good contra views to get the discussion going, because that's always good for debate, I think.
And just one thing to flag that for everybody, that we have gone to a range of different people. To start this process, we've gone wide, and whoever we end up with on the podcast is not due to our selection bias initially. It's people's availability. So we did want to try and knock this over so that we could get this podcast out. So there are plenty of people we did want to speak to who probably won't be available, unfortunately, over the next couple of weeks to speak to us. But not for want of trying, and hopefully we still get that diversity out there as well. All right. Well, you're going to hear from Phil and Martin and myself talk to different people over the next little while. So we hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Brett. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kirsty Busing. Kirsty is an ID physician and also Medical Director of Medical Services at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Kirsty had a very intense role during the recent pandemic in clinical services. And I've got the 3 questions for Kirsty. So welcome, Kirsty, first of all.
Hi, thanks, Phil.
The first question, Kirsty, is with regards to the current contract droplet airborne transmission terminology and the way we subsequently plan and deliver IPC precautions, do you think that needs to change?
Thanks, Phil. I think it does need to change. I think we need to be open to evolving and progressing ideas as new evidence and information emerges. And, if we've learnt nothing in the last couple of years, it's that things can change quickly, and we have to be flexible and responsive. I think what we've learnt, my current understanding is that really with infections that are spread via a respiratory route, that the concept of there being a distinction between droplets and aerosols is artificial, and that it's a continuum. And I therefore think we probably are heading towards a space where we might have for respiratory pathogens something that might be akin to respiratory precautions, and not try and separate it out into 2 separate things. Just understand that that these airborne particles come in all sizes, and that whilst some pathogens may be more or less infective than others, they probably need a different infective dose, and some of the interactions that we have may be higher or lower risk. That when we're closer to people, the concentration of those airborne particles is higher, and so the risk is higher versus if we're further away. So I think that's where we're headed, and that respiratory pathogens would be viewed differently to other pathogens that we know are spread by contact, like MRSA or CPE or other things like that, where we'd be thinking more in a different type of precaution.
So the terminology really droplet airborne, you think, is really can't be applied anymore, can it? It doesn't adequately cover the situation.
In my view, it just doesn't match the science, and you could just condense it all into calling it airborne, because that's what they really are. They're particles that are spread in the air. But if that confuses people because we've used the terminology differently, I would support that if we just got rid of droplet and moved to airborne solely, or if it helped people more to use a different word, that would be very reasonable too. But I think trying to separate them into some that you can use, different types of precautions probably doesn't make sense anymore to me.
Sure. Just one final question. Do you think it also needs to consider the environment that it's been applied in?
Yeah, it does. So you need to think about the pathogen, and you need to think about the environment, the context, and I think that's where also decoupling what mask you might use, what PPE you might use, from whether you need a negative pressure room, because I think that's a real sticking point that people struggle with in a hospital environment. We don't have enough negative pressure rooms, and if we called everything airborne and suddenly needed, if that implied that everything needed a negative pressure room, we wouldn't be able to manage. So I think to some extent, understanding the context would help you to determine when you might need a negative pressure room. So maybe we just need to be rethinking the way we talk about those precautions.
Great. Thanks, Kirsty. That's some really helpful insight. Really appreciate your time. And we'll chat again in the future sometime.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Phil.
Well, hello everybody, Brett Mitchell here, and I've got with me Kathy Dempsey, who's the New South Wales Chief ICP and HIA Advisor for the Clinical Excellence Commission in New South Wales. Hello, Kathy.
Hi, Brett. How are you today?
Wonderful, thanks. And of course, we're talking about contact droplet and airborne precautions. So, Kathy, do you think that contact droplet and airborne transmission terminology needs to change?
Well, I feel like that's a trick question as a result of COVID. Thanks, Brett. Really nice opener. Look, doing some preparation, and it's interestingly, even a published study as recent as May 22 mentions that airborne transmission is possible for COVID. So still doesn't really say that it's absolutely. And I think that's part of the challenge. I think those precautions have served us well in healthcare prior to COVID. I think there's definitely been a kind of shift or a takeover, if you like, of language from other disciplines outside of COVID during, or outside of infection control during the pandemic, which has contributed to complexities. There's definitely a difference between droplet and airborne in health, but I also feel that the difference between droplet and airborne in health, whilst has focused on size of particles, it has also included a risk assessment of dispersal of particles. So infection control has been less about the physical distance that's been often scrutinised in the literature as reasoning for our separation. But, I feel the distancing has been really public health more than infection control. Definitely, we talk about things like droplets generally travel shorter distances, but we don't really say what they are in our guidelines. We talk about droplets being heavy particles, that they usually travel shorter, but aerosols remain suspended prolonged periods and travel long distances. So I think we need to have options. We need to be able to have a risk assessment and the ability to provide safety for healthcare workers with quality, safe patient care, which I think has too often been omitted during the conversations during COVID.
Yeah, look, that's a really important point. Actually, you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah.
Have you got any ideas about how that terminology could either change or how confidence could be restored in that paradigm that you've just described?
Yeah, look, I'm not opposed to change, and I think, there's an opportunity to revisit. Should we be looking at something called respiratory protection, and then underpin respiratory protection with some options which might have, rather than droplet airborne, or it might define droplet airborne with a choice of different protection, but you've still got an overarching respiratory protection model. Interestingly, we've tried to put that out about 3 times now to New South Wales. Let's discuss, let's look at changing. And each time we haven't really been able to settle or land on an approach. Getting closer, but not landing.
Do you think a revision is in the Australian context for our international audience, but it'll probably be very similar in other countries? Do you think that a change in the national approach in national guidelines would help facilitate that? Or do you think this needs to be something that needs to be worked through locally, what works, what doesn't work, and then try and find that solution that sort of is consistent across states or countries?
Look, it's kind of that, that top-down plus, bottom-up approach. It's kind of like all in. Everyone needs to be all in, so we get a global change, which sort of feeds into a national change, which then definitely feeds into a statewide change. And I think without that, you're going to have, disparity and variance across the states, definitely in Australia, and I suspect globally if we don't get a consensus.
Yeah. Look, Kathy, we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we do have to keep everyone to 5 minutes to get through a whole range of people. But thank you so much for your views and thoughts on this, and I hope that that's stimulated some others to think about what they might be thinking about in this area too. So thanks so much for your time, Kathy.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks.